The period of Reconstruction was a very interesting and important time in American history. It was a time when the nation had a chance to rebuild itself in the spirit of its founding. In the words of the Declaration of Independence, it says that all men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights. In this period of Reconstruction, the nation had a chance to actually make those words reality, not just for wealthy white men, but for most of the population, including black people. The period of Reconstruction followed the American Civil War, in which the Union defeated the South. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which was at first a war measure to free all of the slaves only in the South, became the 13th Amendment, effectively abolishing slavery throughout the United States. Now the nation is faced with these large questions. How are the rebellious states, the former Confederacy, how are they going to be reintegrated into the United States of America? Are they going to be treated as enemies that needed rehabilitating? Were they going to be treated as conquered people? Or were they going to be immediately given full status as American states with all of the rights that went with that? These were questions that were up in the air. The other big question was, what was the nation going to do with freedmen? There were different ideas about what should happen to these people. Obviously, the abolitionists wanted them to be given full equality. Obviously, freedmen themselves wanted to be given full equality, wanted to be given American citizenship, the right to vote, and all the privileges that came with that. Whereas those in the South, in the former Confederacy, wanted as little to change as possible. So they had to agree that yes, now slavery is over, but how can we make it so that little else changes, that black people are kept in as close a state to slavery as possible? So there's competing visions in this period of Reconstruction trying to fight for the future of the nation. Reconstruction really began during the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln was thinking about the end of the war and what that future would look like. That was envisioning this post-war country in which black people would be given freedom and equality to some extent. He even talked about in one of his last speeches giving the right to vote to black people before he was assassinated by a Southern sympathizer, John Wilkes Booth. Once Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, that will change the trajectory of Reconstruction moving forward. His inheritor was not sympathetic to his goals for Reconstruction. His vice president was a man named Andrew Johnson. He was a racist man himself from Tennessee. He would have naturally belonged to the Confederacy himself. He was no friend of black people. He did not want them to have rights or privileges in the United States of America, but he hated Southern plantation owners. He was himself a poor white person from the South, but he hated the very wealthy Southern plantation owners who ran the South. So he decided to remain loyal to the Union for this reason. But again, his vision for what the South should look like after the Civil War was not the same as Abraham Lincoln's. And he is the one who is now in charge of this Reconstruction project. Abraham Lincoln's been assassinated. Congress is on their summer recess. Andrew Johnson, the Southern Democrat from Tennessee, has the power. And that is why we call it presidential Reconstruction, because the president led this phase of Reconstruction. So what most freedmen did upon realizing that they actually were now legally free in the United States was put on their best clothes. If they were veterans of the Civil War, the men would wear their Union uniforms and walk about the town celebrating, wearing their best clothes. It was a time of jubilee and celebration. As you can imagine, generations of their people had been subjected to this institution, had been living in this institution of slavery for generations, and that was seemingly ending now, and a bright future seemed to be ahead for them. Once the celebration was over, though, what was the first thing on the mind of a freed person, of a freedman? You would think that it might be economics, it might be finding a job, but really it was finding and piecing together their families. As we know, slavery tore families apart. It didn't respect the institution of marriage. It didn't respect the unit of a black family. So children were often taken from their parents, siblings were split apart, and they were sold off to whoever was the highest bidder. Oftentimes, if you were a slave in the upper South, you would be sold deeper into the South, places like Louisiana and Texas. So once the enslaved people were emancipated, their first priority was to rebuild their broken, fractured families. And they would do this by putting ads in newspapers, as this one here. It says, "Information wanted of my children Lewis, Lizzie, and Kate Mason, whom I last saw in Owensboro, Kentucky. They were then quote-unquote owned by David and John Hart. That is, the girls were, but the boy was rather the property of Thomas Pointer." And she's looking for information about her children who had been split up. All she could really do is say when she last saw or heard of her children, but there's no guarantee that her children are still in those areas. They could have been sold again and again and again. This was the way that they would try to rebuild their families, by putting ads in newspapers. Sometimes this was successful, other times it was not. But even though it was not always successful, what we don't see happen in the Black community is oftentimes we would see in a catastrophe like a war, a Holocaust, a genocide, is that orphanages would spring up to take care of all of the children who were not able to reunite with their families, or who had lost their parents, or who didn't have any parents. So what the Black community does after the Civil War is couples who didn't have children, or who might have had some children, would find these orphans and take care of them. So what is unique about the Black community during Reconstruction is that we don't see a lot of orphanages spring up to take care of orphans who either didn't have parents or couldn't find their parents, because the Black community took care of those children and embraced them and brought them into their families. So you don't see children with nowhere to go or with nobody to rely on. So the community really came together and built new families if they couldn't piece together their own, and nobody was really left to fend for themselves. Aside from building together their families, what were some other things that the Black community would have wanted to do, or would have embraced upon emancipation? That is, they wanted everything that had been denied to them in freedom, and specifically things like education, because it's easy to take education for granted when it's a given. Most of us have access to public education, especially here in the United States, but when it's denied to you, when you don't have that opportunity, then you really feel that absence. And enslaved populations in the United States had been banned from reading, banned from education. That type of empowerment was seen as a threat to the institution of slavery, but also to racist ideas that Black people were not in fact capable of reading, articulating themselves, memorizing poetry, learning the classics, etc. So by allowing them to learn how to read, you're kind of subverting those racist ideas about Black people. So that was not ever allowed to them. Once they attained freedom, pursued education, they pursued their own churches. When they were enslaved, they were allowed to participate in churches, but those churches had to be led by their quote-unquote owner. That the owner would lead them in a church service and often focus on parts of the Bible that spoke about respecting authority, about subservience, nothing about liberation. Whereas when freedmen started their own churches, they would focus on stories such as Moses liberating the Israelites from slavery in Egypt and the freeing power of Jesus Christ, rather than the parts of the Bible that emphasize obeying and respecting and subservience. Church was another way that they were able to pursue their own education. They were able to pursue their own focus on religion rather than be taught what their quote-unquote owner wanted them to know about the Bible. And of course, once they attained freedom, they knew that political freedom was key to maintaining their status, to maintaining their freedom. That if they didn't have the right to vote and participate in politics, which they never were able to do during slavery, then their rights could be quickly stripped away from them. Or if they didn't have any political participation, they might never even get those rights to begin with. Because even though they were free after the Civil War, that didn't mean they were United States citizens or that they had the right to vote or any of this. So Black people understood the importance of having that political freedom, the political right to vote, and make decisions about their own future. And one of the absolute most important things that Black people sought after emancipation was land. Land meant independence for Black people. If they did not have their own land, they could not work for themselves and profit for themselves and grow food and provide for their families for themselves. If they did not own their own land, they could not farm for themselves, but they would also have to rent and live on somebody else's land. And at this point, who owned all the land? It would have been the people who owned them just a couple months before. So if you didn't own your own land, you were having to rent from the people who had owned you very recently and treated you quite brutally and were used to doing whatever they wanted to you. So how is that going to change? Is there a mentality towards you going to change if you're now their renter instead of their property? It's probably, the dynamics are not going to shift very much. So Black people understood if they did not have their own land, they were still going to be subservient to white people, and their position was not going to be that much improved if they still had to rent, if they still had to be under some type of control over the landowners and the plantation owners and the people who just very recently owned them. In this image, you can see a mob of white people on one side, very angry, and Black people on the other side, some of them dressed in Union uniforms because they were in fact veterans of the Civil War. In between them is a federal agent who is blocking the mob of white people from attacking the Black people. And what very commonly happened after the Civil War, after emancipation, is the entire hierarchy of the South, in which white people saw themselves as superior to Black people, had been subverted. And by giving Black people any type of equality with white people, think about a scale in which one is above the other, and now you're giving them equality. For white people, they felt that their position had now diminished, their way of life was threatened, and they had these deeply ingrained beliefs about Black people and their status in community. Many of them didn't think that they were fully human. Many of them didn't think that they deserved to walk on the same streets as white people. So now you're having to reckon with and deal with this fact that they are now equal people. So a lot of white people in the South react in violence and start attacking Black people as they're celebrating their newfound freedom. In one instance in Memphis, Black veterans of the Union Army put on their uniforms, their Union United States uniforms. They celebrated in the streets. They were dancing, they were happy, and a mob of white people came out and started hunting down African Americans, burn their churches and burn their schools. So this was a common problem in the South. The federal government decided to create this bureau called the Freedmen's Bureau, a bureau to help the freedmen. And this agent in the middle of this picture is an agent of the Freedmen's Bureau, keeping the white mob at bay and protecting the African Americans from being hunted and potentially killed. That was one of their roles, to prevent violence against Black people in the South. Some of their other roles were helping to establish schools for Black people in the South and helping to establish hospitals. Another goal of theirs that was not very successful was the redistribution of land to African Americans. And the idea was, among many in the North, that these large plantations, hundreds of acres that were owned by a couple wealthy white men in the South, that those plantations should be broken up because the people who owned them were traitors to the United States and they didn't deserve to hold on to that property, that they, as losers of the war, deserved some type of punishment. They deserved to have their properties confiscated and given to those who remained loyal to the United States and oftentimes fought for the United States as soldiers, and that is the freedmen, the Black population of the South. So the Freedmen's Bureau attempted to give 40 acres and a mule to many of these freedmen, but that would not be successful because of opposition from the president. Now, the mission of the Freedmen's Bureau was met with a lot of resistance in the South, and again, most of that is because their hierarchy and what they had been taught for generations had now been subverted, and now they feel in anger and bitterness at the fact that they now have to treat the people who they had full power and control over as equals now. So there's a lot of resistance to the Freedmen's Bureau's work in the South, as you can tell in this propaganda image. It says the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency to keep the Black person in idleness at the expense of the white man. Twice vetoed by the president, Andrew Johnson, and made a law by Congress. Support Congress and you support the Black person. Sustain the president and you protect the white man. So there's already this idea that the president of the United States, Andrew Johnson, was on their side at the time. In this image, you can tell that they made the Black person a caricature, kind of animal, ape-like, not like a real person you would actually see. They're making this argument that they are not fully people, that they are partially animals. And what activity is he doing? He's laying on his back. He's slothful. He's not working. He doesn't know how to work. Instead, you see the hardworking white people in the back chopping wood, working a plow. And the message here is that any attempt by the Freedmen's Bureau to really just even the playing field and give black people who are coming out of slavery, who have absolutely nothing, something to start their lives with. But any attempt to give them this starting support, whether it's land, resources, money, whatever it is, was seen by white people in the South as government handouts for the lazy African American to the detriment of the hardworking white people, which obviously wasn't the case, because we know that the enslaved Africans were the ones doing all the work, building the success that the South enjoyed, more so than the white population in the South. But this idea was really just to discredit the Freedmen's Bureau as an anti-white institution, and also helped to propagate this idea of black people as lazy and slothful and not willing to work. A lot of these stereotypes stick around for a very long time. So what did Andrew Johnson, the president himself, want Reconstruction to look like? We know the Southerners, the former Confederates, didn't want anything to change. Black people wanted certain things. What did the president want? Well, when it came to land, Andrew Johnson was not willing to give black people equality. Johnson's vision for Reconstruction was basically that they had to repudiate their articles of secession, thus rejoining the nation, and they had to ratify the 13th Amendment, which at this point they knew that they had to do. Other than that, they could pretty much do whatever they wanted. Johnson was not going to interfere, and he didn't want the federal government to interfere with southern states and what they did. So they could rebuild their states in any way that they wanted to. And that's pretty much where Johnson thought Reconstruction should go, and it should end. When it came to the Freedmen Bureau's attempts to give land to African Americans, President Johnson vetoed that, and they would not end up getting their 40 acres and a mule. Because of President Johnson's resistance to this, African Americans were stuck as sharecroppers, which pretty much meant that they lived on a white person's piece of land, didn't pay rent, and they worked that land for them and got to keep some of the profits of their work, and the rest they would give to the owner of that land. So they did get some wages, they were paid some, but now you have these power dynamics where enslaved Africans are working on the same land that they worked as slaves, doing the same job that they had as slaves. They couldn't really leave that land because it was the only job they had, and the person who had control over them was the same people who had control of them during slavery, who was used to beating them, who were used to doing what they wanted with them, who were used to exploiting them. So what most historians agree on is that this was basically slavery in another name, that in practicality most black people after the Civil War were stuck in these subservient roles to the very people who owned them before emancipation. And black people understood this. In South Carolina, a group of freedmen came together and petitioned the president to please give them their land that had been promised to them by General Sherman and the Freedmen's Bureau. They wrote, "Here is where secession was born and nurtured. Here is where we have toiled nearly all of our lives as slaves and treated like dumb-driven cattle. This is our home. We have made these lands what they were. We are the only true and loyal people that were found in possession of these lands. We have been always ready to strike for liberty and humanity, yea, to fight if need be to preserve this glorious union. Shall not we, who are freedmen and have always been true to this union, have the same rights as are enjoyed by others? Are not our rights as a free people and good citizens of these United States to be considered before those who were found in rebellion against this good and just government? Are we who have been abused and oppressed for many long years not to be allowed the privilege of purchasing land, but be subject to the will of these large landowners? God forbid. Land monopoly is injurious to the advancement of the course of freedom, and if government does not make some provision by which we as freedmen can obtain a homestead, we have not bettered our condition." So they're telling the president straight off, we know that if you do not allow us to have the land that was promised to us, we have not bettered our condition since slavery. We are still subservient to the same people. And this brings us to how presidential Reconstruction would end. Largely, it was a failure. Andrew Johnson was not willing to do what needed to be done to bring the South back into the nation in a realistic way. and to bring free black people into the nation in a realistic way. He basically told the Southern governments, recreate yourselves however you want, and then join the nation once again. And that's exactly what they did. The Southern states elected the very representatives to Congress that voted for secession before the Civil War. So the very leaders who led the South into civil war, into secession, were the ones who they sent back to Congress and said, okay, this is our government, we're ready to go. So thus the governments in the South look very similar to the way they did before the Civil War. Where at the end of this war, it was the most deadly war for the United States. And at the end of it, nothing has changed. So what was it all for? These new governments in the South immediately start working to pass laws or black codes in order to regulate the lives of black people in the South. Because now they are no longer slaves, but that doesn't mean they're citizens, that doesn't mean they're free, that doesn't mean they're protected under the United States Constitution as white people are. So what the South does is starts regulating their lives with these black codes. The black codes give African Americans some rights. They are allowed to marry, they're allowed to draw up their own contracts, they're allowed to own property. These are things that weren't allowed to them during slavery, but for the most part, it was detrimental to them. They were not allowed to serve in state militias, they were not allowed to sit on juries, they were not allowed to testify against a white person. So if a white person committed a crime against a black person and their black peers came together to sue him in court or to try to get some type of justice, none of their words would matter against the white person. So that leaves a lot of room for abuse. And one of the worst aspects of these black codes were something called the vagrancy laws, which pretty much took away a black person's right to have any type of leisure. The vagrancy laws, as can be read here. So Section 2 of the vagrancy laws state all freedmen found with no lawful employment or business or found unlawfully assembling themselves together shall be deemed vagrants and fined a sum. So basically, if you're hanging out in the street, if you're hanging out outside of a store, if you're doing anything leisurely, if you're basically doing anything besides working, you can be fined a large sum. And in Section 7, we find out what happens if you can't pay this large sum, which obviously they can't because they're just coming out of slavery and they don't really have jobs, and if they do, they're being paid very poorly. If any freedman shall refuse or fail to pay this tax, it shall be the duty of the sheriff to arrest such freedman and proceed at once to hire for the shortest time such delinquent taxpayer to any who will pay the said tax. So if they can't pay their fine once they're fined, they're arrested. But if somebody from the outside comes in and pays that fine, the imprisoned black person has to then go work for whoever paid their fine. Who do we think is going to come around and pay their fine? Oftentimes, their former owners are going to come and pay their fine and basically get them back to, quote unquote, work off that debt, right? So that's basically a way to re-enslave and get the enslaved people back onto the plantations where they used to work. And then it states every civil officer and every person may arrest and carry back to his or her legal employer any freedman, free black person, or mulatto who shall have quit the service of his or her employer before the expiration of his or her term of service without good cause. So then anybody can just arrest these people for walking around, take them back to the plantation. It's basically slavery with a different name. And the Republicans in Congress saw it as such. So William Stewart, a Republican senator, said, "We must see to it that the man made free by the Constitution of the United States is a free man indeed." So Republicans in Congress saw the way that the South was building their governments after the war, and the way that they were treating the freedmen after the war. And the Republicans in Congress said, we're not going to stand for this. And they basically took power from the president once they came back into session. Once Congress came back to session, the South sent all of the Confederate leaders back to Congress. All these representatives from before the war went back to Congress, ready to take up their jobs again. Leaders of the Confederacy showing up to the United States Congress, ready to work. And the Republicans said, nope, we're not seating you in Congress. You all need to go home, and we're taking over from here. So this next stage of Reconstruction is going to be led by the Republican Party rather than the President Andrew Johnson. So this is where presidential Reconstruction ends and radical Reconstruction begins.